Oh, Steve is here. Yay. Okay, good. Steve is the director of sales at CB Warburg. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I assume that's our fault, and I'm going to go ahead and say it is. You
That's my
can't say
fault.
your sandwich now until the end, but as a fellow New Yorker, I know you have a good one, so I'm going to save it to the end. And you can't believe it, Steve, but Sean said Katz's. I mean, come on. Okay, so next.
I'll
Okay,
have what
so
he's having.
okay.
If you know Caspers
Perfect.
and you know movies, you know the line.
Yes, I do. Okay, perfect. That's like the best entrance to any webinar ever. So, Sean, can you talk to us a little bit about where recruiting is today and give us kind of set the table? I know it's your expertise, so maybe kind of shoot off some stats and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think there's probably a lot of recruiting webinars and presentations that folks in the audience have sat through before, right? So I think one of the questions is why are we talking about recruiting when there's a settlement going on and there's plenty of other
Exactly.
technologies in the space, right? And so to answer that question, I kind of looked to some of the data, right? So I think one of the things that we observe, right, is more than 17% of productive agents moved between brokerages last year. So when we think about that and what that means, like those agents account for north of $15 billion of commissions that moved from one brokerage to another brokerage in
17%.
2023.
That's
That's
huge.
right. Yeah, that's right. And so, it's easy, like in the media, we get fixated on interest rates and we understand why we get fixated on that because it's very closely correlated to the velocity of transactions and brokerages make money and agents make money based on transactions occurring. But we see this kind of massive migration of agents between firms each year. And I think that actually presents real opportunities for brokerages when we think about a slow market or even think about a market where in a post-settlement world where a variety of different things can happen, which we can get into. So I think recruiting we've seen can be a really nice counterbalance or foil against what is otherwise a slow market. And so I think that's why it continues to be, and it for some is actually more top of mind than it was even in the height of the pandemic, where everything was low, everything was high except interest rates, right? I think a couple of other things that I talk about, right? So 17% of productive agents. So, but which agents within that group actually move, right? And so I think one of the interesting things, and it's probably no surprise to folks, is there's this persistent inverse correlation between sales volume and your likelihood to switch between a company, from one company to another. So in terms of some numbers, right? Those $50 million sales volume agents and above, right? Those top producers, people who make it onto the Real Trends rankings and are the number one agent in their respective office. Only about 5% or 1 in 20 of those agents move between companies each year. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, in that, call it $1 to $5 million sales volume segment, it's close to 19% or 1 in 5 agents are moving between one brokerage and another brokerage that year. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about, especially that last point, when I meet a lot of brokerages that focus exclusively on brand new agents, right? So you kind of often see that type of approach. And what you find is that the opportunity of focusing just on the $1 to $5 million segment versus the brand new agents is 4 times greater in terms of the revenue that comes to those brokerages in their first year. And so there's a bunch of different segments and they move differently. And I think some of the innovative brokerages are starting to, and I think my co-panelists here, right, are looking at kind of investing in their growth in a time when the market is otherwise slow, because it's a really nice way to kind of counteract what is otherwise a little bit of a depressed market that we're in right now.
Okay, good. That sets the table. Those are stats I did not know, so that's super interesting to me. And I know we're going to dig into a little deeper of new agents versus experienced agents in recruiting. But let's, talk about the elephant in the room, which is really why we're doing this topic, which is how the settlement has changed recruiting. And yeah, since we actually even did a prep call, Element just settled, Steve, and I know Home Services is settled, so everybody's settling. It's done. It's over, right? Everybody will settle very quickly. So let's talk about how the settlement is changing it by perception and things like that. So I'll start maybe with Chip. In terms of what your perception is of how I'm going to go around a little bit because I want everybody's insight onto this.
Sure.
Go ahead, Chip.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that recruiting for one has always been part of the lifeblood to really building a sustainable business. So it's something that's always been important. And you're right. I think there's more of an emphasis on it now. I think part of that is because the time of uncertainty with, an industry-wide concern of potential commission compression. And then I think also because of that uncertainty, agents are looking for a company that they feel like can really navigate and adapt to the changing waters of the environment. So if anything, I think the settlement for us has placed an even heavier emphasis on bringing on experienced agents. And
Right.
that's always been our focus over new agents. So as we talk through our discussion, that'll be more of my point of view is a focus on experience rather than brand new.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and because for the obvious reasons that the industry is probably going to get a little more difficult, right, to navigate. So it's not quite as the transaction is not quite as out of the box. What about you, Tyler?
I feel if we look back even, let's say, I don't know, 30, 40 years, like the real estate industry has dealt with insanely high interest rates. We had the mortgage back collapse in 2010. Then it was the intro to all these online portals. And I feel like it's always been a constant big hurdle that we're overcoming. And I feel like this is another one of those hurdles. I think that the industry is going to be fine personally. We are not getting a lot of pushback or even questions. In fact, I would say almost the opposite. Like we're getting more questions from the newbies that are coming into the business. And they're saying, asking, how is it going to change the industry? And for them, it's really not going to change the industry because when they're coming into it, it is going to be what it is, right? Like they're going to be adapting to the new terms and conditions. For the seasoned agents, and this could be, I could be a little bit insulated because Windermere in our marketplace, like we're known for being high level, very professional, and it's not really going to be changing a whole lot for us either besides a couple of forms. Could I be wrong? Sure. But I don't really see it shaking up the industry, just like all these other things that we were just talking about that have come along.
I think that's actually an interesting perspective, which is that it reminds me of like kids having cell phones or something, right? This is the new, we call it the new normal, right? So for the newbies, they'll learn. It's harder for the experienced agents. What's your take on that, Steve?
Again, bearing in mind that we have a somewhat different market here in New York, we have been talking since the settlement. I've been preaching and preaching to agents and teaching agents how to express and defend their value proposition. Agents up until now haven't necessarily had to do that. A listing agent tells the seller, here's what my commission is, and I'll split it with the other guy. And the other guy was able to, with proper assurances and agreements, be assured that he was going to get paid part of the commission. Well, that's not the case now anymore. And sellers are questioning commissions a little more. Buyers agents aren't assured necessarily of commissions anymore from the sell side. And it's up to listing agents to be able to articulate why it's best for an owner to offer compensation to both sides. But if the owner is not, or if the owner is not offering proper compensation, then it's up to a broker or an agent, realtor, to now have to assure himself or herself that they're going to get paid what they're worth. And that's a conversation they've never had to have before. And where that impacts, where I fear where I think that that's going to start impacting is in those agents who use artificial means to draw in unsuspecting people and converting them. We have grown very enamored of technology, which gets all sorts of leads from all sorts of places right now. And that's going to be the least assurable source for the revenue that a buyer's agent especially is going to have to assure himself of. So what's going to happen? Our business at Warburg, Coldwell Bank of Warburg in New York, has always been a business built on sphere of influence and learning and teaching agents how to build their sphere. And it's within that sphere that the certainty of being fairly compensated exists. And to the extent that that'll shake out a lot of people who were used to more artificial means of creating that, of stepping into the business and very quickly picking up some leads that they could work with, I think that's where we're going to see a really more fundamental change coming out of the settlements that have taken place.
That's an interesting point too, which is I do think like people have if they know you, they have no issue compensating you. So a friend of mine who bought a property, I said, well, you don't have to use a buyer's agent now, just do what you want to do. But the minute she had met that person, right, she didn't feel comfortable denying them some amount of compensation or even negotiating that compensation. So I'm going to turn it to Sean. On that note, do you think this, and I know you're the recruiting expert and work with a ton of companies, do you think that this makes buyer agents and listing agents more attractive than buyer's agents? Like in a portfolio of agents, what's the mix? Like, so when you talk to folks and you're working with them, are they like, yeah, I just want listing agents now, the hell with it? Or what? I know that's probably not realistic, but what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so I think if we are following the news, that I'm sure a lot of the folks in, on the panel and in the audience are, right? There's a lot of, I guess, speculation on a variety of different outcomes, right? And I think one of the things that we all should do from the perspective of the brokerage, right, is to think about a variety of potential scenarios and then plan for any of those scenarios kind of occurring, right? So Chip talked about buyer agent commission erosion. I think Steve is kind of getting at that as well with the defending your value proposition. He's also talking about sphere of influence agents versus listing agents. And I think, versus lead-based agents, right? And I think in terms of whatever happens in those scenarios, the approach that I like to kind of think about is really coming from the financial investing side to think about modern portfolio theory. And in modern portfolio theory, there is a tenet around diversification in which you have a basket of assets. So in this case, these are our agents who are our revenue streams. And we want to essentially prepare for a variety of different outcomes, right? So in the sense that buyer's agent commissions may be eroded over time, you may want to think about shifting your mix or your portfolio of agents to also include agents that have that listing side business and also kind of a sphere of influence type of agent, right? And I think it's in my mind, it's a whole lot harder to kind of slowly try to train all of your folks, kind of change exactly what they're doing. Of course, you'll do that, but it's also easier in terms of things that we can control with nearer term results to start focusing more proactively on recruiting and start to recruit some of the segments that maybe you believe in a variety of scenarios might actually outperform in the future or continue to perform relative to others that are maybe more threatened or, to use the financial term, riskier, right, in the future, right? So if you have a business where you have 5 agents and the whole company is focused on Zillow leads, and suddenly we need buyer's agent agreements at the beginning of that kind of relationship with the buyer, that could be threatened in the future, right? And the commission rates, if it's not paid by the seller, could be lower in the future. And so from a modern portfolio theory would suggest kind of also, in addition to that group, looking to add some folks that provide some resilience against that potential outcome. And so that's what I spend a lot of time at Corded with my customers on, is thinking through some of these different strategies and some of these different segments, and then actually executing on finding those agents quickly and incorporating them into the fold.
Okay, good. And I subscribe to, well, whether it's modern or old, portfolio theory, which is, keep a mix of your assets, and your agents are your assets, right? So it's certainly the same argument. So Chip, when at
Yeah.
Michael Saunders, is this you're subscribing to this? And I mean, is this how you're trying to do it?
Yeah, and I think just adding to what Sean had mentioned, if I had to categorize the agents who would be the most attractive, I think one would be highest quality of agent, and whether they're stronger in listings or in buyer sales, I think that's somewhat irrelevant. I mean, we go back to that old saying of you list to last, and there's something to be said for that. So of course, typically most of the top agents are heavier in listings. But I'll quote one of our associates, Mark Bomeg. He says that he thinks this will be a time where the good become great and the weak become cheap. And I think it's, I've really liked that line. And I think the second kind of categorization of agents who would be attractive would be agents who are confident. And that could be someone who's newer in the business. Kind of as Tyler had mentioned, you have these people who are coming in and there aren't any expectations that are already set. So with that confidence, especially in our market where we have not had buyer broker agreements that are required, agents who are confident in their value proposition.
Well, it's funny. I think I told you that, Chip. I sat with a guy at a party who was on the younger side. He'd been in business about 4 years, was part of the bigger team. They'd actually done a fair amount they'd done like 11 transactions in the first like couple of months, first quarter basically, which is pretty good. And I asked him if and he's a buyer's agent because I think he's on their team in that role, which is common to come in as, sort of on the buyer side first. And I said, is it coming up with the lawsuits? And he said, oh, yeah. And I said, are you having any issue with it? He said, no. He said, we tell them sign it or not, we earn it. And we show them how we earn it. And to your point, it was exactly the way you said it, Chip. He had no hesitation and no issue. Like, oh, no, it wasn't like, we're getting beat up, the horse is out of the barn, it's Napster, it should be free. There was none of that. So, Tyler, how about you guys? What are you seeing like in terms of that? Are you
Well,
trying to keep a mix and things like that? I mean,
yeah, definitely trying to keep a mix. I will say, and my role is going to be a little bit different from the other gentlemen on the board that work directly with the brokerages because my team works for services, so we are spread out across all of our franchise owners. So we really focus on just the scalability of our system and process. Obviously, that's how I connected with Sean because our priority has definitely shifted to more seasoned agents. But I think just going back to one of the things we were talking about earlier is I think that this is really a good thing because I think when you start shaking up the industry like this, you get out or get rid of the part-timers and the strong will survive. And honestly, it happens every probably 10 years or a little bit more. And I think that it'll be a good thing for the industry. Everybody will have to refine their skills and we will earn the commissions that much more.
well, and I've said that on a couple of webinars, which is like, look, even if it's a concierge model, and even if a buyer's agent, charges you $2,000 just to show you houses for 2 months, they're validating their time.
Yeah.
So I think it will be, I do like that line as well, Chip, where it's the time for the good to, the good to get great, and things like that. I think competition, anybody who's in sales knows competition is actually good for you. It keeps you
I'll
strong.
just jump in for a minute, Audrey. I think when we
Yeah,
think
sure.
of recruiting, we focus so heavily on those top agents. And as Sean had mentioned in those statistics, a 5% versus kind of a 15 or 20% chance of agent movement. And so what we've really been pushing is looking at those up and coming agents and the rising stars. And if I reflect back a few years ago when I was working with a company in upstate New York, there was an agent who was licensed for maybe a year or two. And I said, there's something special about her. I know she's a go-getter. She just needs the support of a company like ours. And so fast forward 3.5 years later, she's a number 2 agent at that company. And so that would be, that's someone that she might not be at the top of someone's recruiting hit list because she's not a top agent, but I knew she had the potential of being so.
Yeah, actually, I'll tell you, hiring salespeople is like the hardest thing in the planet. So let me go around and say, so I don't envy any of you or me when I have to do it. So let's talk a little bit about your guys' models. And then I want to jump into some stuff that's a little bit spicier, because you know me, I like to keep it a little bit spicy about aggressive tactics. But for your models for recruiting, I'll start with you, Steve. Like what do you guys use to recruit? I know some of these guys do use Sean, which is great. And but what do you guys use, Steve? What do you guys use as your model?
Well, for starters, I just have to just talk for a second about how we're hampered in the New York marketplace with respect to recruiting. And that is that in the RLS, which is the Real Estate Board's form of residential listing system, the buy side of the deals are not registered. So we have absolutely no way to determine a broker's true GCI, except by what they tell us or what the 1099 will show us. But you know, there are all sorts of metrics that agents can see around the country from data in the MLS that we just don't have. So we start out with that handicap. And also our method of evaluating our model starts with our splits, which in our particular case, with rare exception, never go as higher than 75%. Why is that? Because we provide a lot of marketing support that other agents don't have. So we take a look sometimes, and our goal is not necessarily to take the heaviest hitter and the biggest volume agents where we're earning less and actually spending more, but focusing, if we can, on a middle tier of agent where the sweet spot is a lot sweeter for us. And we just as soon focus on the agents that are just starting out, that are showing a lot of potential, and with the resources we're able to bring, boost their income substantially to where they become big earners. Do we employ TARP payments? Sure we do. Do we give recruiting bonuses to agents with a clawback provision? We all do that, and agents do that. Our clawbacks tend to be less onerous in terms of how they work out, and a lot clearer, so there are no hidden features that essentially lock somebody in without them knowing they're locked in. But you know, we also use our agents as recruiting tools. You know,
All right, you're jumping ahead, man. You're jumping ahead to the spicy stuff. You couldn't help yourself. We're going to get into aggressive tactics in a minute, which you are alluding to. So before we jump to aggressive tactics, let me just go
Are there
to
any other kinds?
I don't know. That's a fair question. I had a feeling you were going to say that too. So before we go to the aggressive tactics, generally, do we need to ask the question for Tyler and Chip of your models of like, how do you have a model for recruiting, or should we just jump right in and go to aggressive tactics? By the way, for our audience, please feel free to throw up some questions that we'll try and get to at the end.
I'll share just a second for our model, just because I think it is probably pretty unique compared to most. Again, we service our 300 franchise. That's basically a small team. I have 2 VAs in the Philippines, and then I have 3 recruiters. To put things in context, that team has interviewed about 8,200 candidates since we've been doing this for about 5 years. We are constantly refining our process. In the last 90 days, we've actually interviewed 1,074 agents.
Oh my God.
So I came from being at Zillow for 8 years. And so I'm taking the whole lead gen model and applying it to the recruiting process. And if I'm doing my job correctly, I look at having my recruiters' calendars with 6 appointments per day. That's kind of my goal. If they're shy of that, then basically it's kind of like I don't want to call her a runner-up, but our old prospector then basically kicks in to make sure that their calendars are full, at least 6 appointments for the next 72 hours. So there's a couple of things that we're doing that's a little bit different. So for the most part, we do this for all 300 franchises. We don't have the power to hire for those offices, but we're doing the pre-screening. So right out of the gate, we are pre-screening and scraping out 63% of those people. And then basically we are introducing the rest of them across our network to the different offices, putting it in their court to basically recruit them if they think that they're a good fit for their offices.
So it's a numbers game really for you guys.
It is a numbers game.
Okay.
On the flip side of that, we are testing a new model. Basically, we'll just call it Summit because that's the name of it. It is a virtual brokerage, but it's a collaboration among probably 32 offices in that area. Because for the most part, I'd say a lot of people don't enjoy recruiting and training on new agents or agents to the next level. So This is a new dedicated hub that gets the resources from all 32 offices in that area. And it's a fully dedicated office just for training and training them into the business, where then we place them
Oh,
back
nice.
into the offices.
Huh.
So it's a
That's-
little
that's-
different spin on it.
Yeah,
but
I like
it
that. That's
seems to be
interesting. And
working
then,
pretty well.
and I think for a company of Windermere size, that's probably paramount and different than it is for Chip and Steve's brokerages are not small, but they're not national. So and you guys are pretty much national. So what about you, Chip? Before I get into aggressive stuff, and is there? Do you want to model beyond that, or what do
Yeah,
you think?
I think that, listen, there are dozens and dozens of different models that you could have related to recruiting. And I think the common denominator is just consistency. When I think about when I started in the business as an agent, you're working on transactions and you're go, go, go. And what are you forgetting about? And that's prospecting and constantly filling up that pipeline. And the same goes for recruiting. As far as our model, we have about 600 agents and 10 branch managers. And the branch managers are the ones that own recruiting for their offices. And again, really more so focused on the experience side versus the new side. The reason being is that they're the experts in their market. They know the key players. They know the people. We've been using Sean's software since last summer or last fall. This year to date, we've recruited more experienced agents than we have the entire year of 2023. I think part of that is a system that we're now using. It's a system that the managers believe in. It's also because of that system, we're having more discussions around growth, around recruiting, and then really involving the full leadership team. So when we're attempting to bring on some of our larger agents, we'll have them meet with Michael and Drayton Saunders. They'll meet with our CMO. Any of us will step in. So it's a total team effort and hands-on approach.
All right, so that's and actually a number of the largest brokerages in the country use Sean's software. So I think that's a really very good plug for Sean, and appropriately so. I met with Sean last week and I was just amazed. So he's clearly doing something right. So let me talk about what sort of is the aggressive tactics. Let's go there because it'll be fun. And so what is some of the more aggressive tactics that you guys are seeing? I'll ask you guys and then I'll come around to Sean at the end to say, how does he recommend, again, as the expert, you deal with those tactics? But we're talking about, obviously there's splits, there's payouts, there's like, what are you seeing? How do you deal with it? And then we'll see what Sean recommends. Steve, you started it, so now you have to jump in.
Well, it's aggressive. One of the most aggressive points. One are dollars that we throw out.
Or what are you seeing? I mean, like, how do you deal with it? Like,
part of it requires, we ask an agent if they are interested in receiving an offer. We ask them for copies of their 1099s, and we really just don't toss money around. Maybe that's conservative.
you do or you don't toss money around?
We don't toss money around. It's got to have some
How many people hang up on you after you don't toss money around? I mean, are you just basically like, if you're not tossing money around and they don't want to hear it, you don't want to be with them?
No, not necessarily.
It's like speed dating?
Not necessarily. It's very interesting. The last several agents that we brought on have been decent producers, 500,000-600,000 GCI, and we're far more interested in having, marketing support and dollars earmarked towards marketing than to give them something they can take a trip on.
Because that costs them money, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, TARP money results in a 1099. Give them an expense account that they can use for their marketing, and that's not income that they recognize. And so we've customized it in a way, and yeah, we've been aggressive in a way, but again, it boils down to each agent having a specific need that we identify and that we address, not just toss money around. Too many some of our competitors, have just tossed money and splits around, as a way to just lure people in. And that's not what we do. We also use our agents, and we have to be careful in using our agents, because I don't want to be telling our agent X over here who wants me to bring in somebody that she's getting her deal, but I'm bringing this new agent in with a much bigger deal.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Be careful with that.
Yeah.
But we view these individually. We work with our finance people at Coldwell Banker. in terms of numbers that make sense. That's as aggressive as we are. And maybe we're not as aggressive as we should be, or some of our competitors are, but that's also why we've been pretty successful over the past year for our sake in bringing in, increasing our agent role and benefiting from retention as well.
Yeah.
We talk, the flip side of recruiting is retention.
Yeah,
And-
we'll get to that. Again, wait.
Okay, sorry.
No, I'm teasing you. But listen, I think like, let me ask you a question before I go to Tyler, and maybe Tyler can answer this. But we know that some of the firms out there that are drawing numbers are very aggressive, and there has splits, and then there's clawbacks. Do you guys, in terms of dealing with that, and we'll go into a minute besides money, like what do we do to kind of bring people in, culture, marketing? We'll go into that in a second. But do you guys point out, hey, they're going to claw it back, you're going to owe it back over there? Do you make sure that you're aware? Do you do a comparison analysis, Tyler? Do you, like, when you're, frankly, if you're competing with Anywhere or KW or any other national
Yeah,
franchise? I don't know
yeah,
if
we do.
they do it
Yeah,
all.
and I mean, it's, every person you talk to, they're going to be at different brokers, they're going to be at a different stage of their business. So it's going to always be all over the board. And I think that that's where having a good pulse on the structures of your competitors, what is their value prop compared to ours? You have to be able to know what that is and adapt quickly in order for it to make sense. Obviously, you're not going to win them all, but that's the best first step. To date, we have not put out any money to buy agents. We just haven't done it. We've talked about it a handful of times. Windermere is unique in that way, where it's third generation family owned, and I guess it just doesn't feel like it's our model. It's like, we believe in our value prop, and we're not for everybody. And we're super ultra focused on culture. And when I say that, one of the stats that really sold me to come over to Windermere is our average agent tenure is 14 years. And if you think about that, I just like to say, like, hey, when people come to Windermere, they stay. And why is that?
Yeah.
Might be different for different reasons, but it's a very strong indicator of the quality of company that it is. And it lets it speak for itself.
Yeah, I think that's good. What about you, Chip?
Well, I think that there are companies who will recruit on split, and then there are companies who will recruit on value, and that's a more difficult play there. I think, in my opinion, those are the types of companies that will continue to move the industry forward in a professional way. I guess our biggest differentiators are our own people. We have an average per person productivity of about 7 million per agent. You look at our nearest competitor, and that's around 2 or 3 million. So for us, the numbers speak for themselves, but similar to what Tyler was saying, we're a company that has always been selective in wanting the right people who would be a fit. And so again, it's not so much a numbers game, but it's hiring high quality and those who really believe in the culture and see value in what we provide. So we are not ones who write checks and get caught up in a split game.
So, okay, Sean. So what we're hearing Tyler, definitely they're playing a numbers game in terms of like reaching out in a big way, but the people who come tend to stay. Same for Steve, same for Chip, I'm sure. I think all three of these are probably representative of that. I wouldn't have thought that for Windermere, so that's super interesting, Tyler. Just because it's a larger company, but you're right. I do think there's something to being family owned and people who have their name on the business, and all three of you have that. So what do you find, Sean, in terms of when you're talking to folks about the best way to compete? I know you have stats and can help them, with the data, but beyond the data, what do you tell your clients?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I used to lead national expansion for what is now currently a very large company. And, I think, my experience there was, one, recruiting is really important. Two, it's very capital and time intensive. And the reason for that is because we tend not to have the data available in this industry at our fingertips to identify interesting ponds of opportunity, right? So if you're fishing, are you going to go to the place where all the other boats are, or if you could find a place that had a lot of other fish and there's no boats that you want to go, kind of go bring your boat to that area. And so that's kind of what Chip was alluding to earlier, right? So there's this obsession where people will often look at last year's production, sort by the biggest, and start calling them. And that segment of agents tends to be over recruited. And that segment of agents tend to be less profitable or unprofitable, to Steve's point. And the recruiting premium, or the premium above this kind of the expectation of split for agents that are at your firm at those levels, tend to be much higher at those levels of production. So you could be spending a lot of money to induce $100 million producer to join, versus what you're currently paying a $100 million producer at your company. So the difference between the split to retain and the split to recruit is a recruiting premium.
Well, can I ask you a question,
if
Sean? I'm going to interrupt you for a second because I have a question popped into my head. Do you recruit the high performing agents so that you can get the blurb in Inman? And here's a question for all of you. Sean, you answer first. Does the high performing agent attract other agents? I'm just honest to God, I really don't know. Do they really follow one another that way? Does it bring I mean, forget the fact that they might have a team. Do they really attract other agents? Is it worth the money in that you are then more likely to pick up those mid-size agents because that big agent came over? Sorry to interrupt.
I'll just say,
Yeah.
I see it causes momentum. It creates the buzz, right? So it gets people sparked up and interested. It's not going to be like that by itself, but it's going to be that with whatever else you're doing, that they're going to be seeing the exposure that's happening.
So they could be a loss leader. So it's a bit of a loss leader. And
Yeah.
they could be technically. So go ahead. Sorry, Sean, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was curious
That's
about
okay.
that.
No, I think listen, when I was launching markets for Compass, right? Often what we would do was we would go find 7 or 8 of the top 10 or top 15 agents and try to get one from a variety of different companies that we thought would be great folks to kind of pull from, right? From their colleagues. And I think in that approach, it was actually successful in terms of generating the momentum, generating the buzz. We would have PR lined up. It was a very orchestrated process to go through.
Yeah.
That. And I think if you play it correctly, there's a version in which that makes sense. Now, I want to have this huge caveat that if you're a top producer, it doesn't mean that you have followership. There are plenty of top producers with a terrible reputation, and any agent who's been in that local market will know. So there is this, it's almost more important.
That's a very good point.
Chip was kind of alluding to this. The quality and the reputation of the agent is more important than their last 12-month sales model. If they happen to be a top producer and a mainstay in the industry, and they happen to give a lot and have a lot of mentors, that's a really interesting combination. But I don't think it's if you flip the question around and say, is it required to be profitable and recruit agents? I say no. It is a lever that you can pull if you want, but you have to be very careful about the reputation of the person and make sure you're recruiting good, well-liked and well-respected people. But I think that the real opportunity, if we're thinking about P&Ls that look fairly dire right now and interest rates that are above 7%, that we weren't necessarily expecting, I think finding those agents in the, call it $1 to $25 million sales volume range that will all have a slightly different split depending on the market that you're in. Those tend to be the most profitable agents for the company. And there's plenty of folks in that group that actually have a future profile that looks even more attractive than what they've done in the past. Now, the problem is, Chip was given the example of kind of finding this agent who had these amazing intrinsics and he could just see that that was going to happen. The problem is, unless you have this personal relationship with all of these folks, it's impossible. It's impossible with the kind of superficial data, particularly for Steve in New York, with the superficial data only on the list side that he has to identify or delineate between an agent whose best year is in front of them or behind them, unless you use more data and unless you use modern technology. So I think one of the things that we do, right, is obviously is we use AI, and specifically predictive analytics and machine learning. And we deliver 2 things. So Tyler and Chip's team, they're looking at future growth scores. So they're looking at future looking sales volume numbers for every agent and a likelihood to leave their company, along with a number of other things that might kind of intuit that it's the right time for an agent to make a move. And the result of kind of taking more data and using it in your process is you can get better conversion rates and you can have shorter recruiting cycles. And that's really what we need to do, because all of brokerages don't have infinite budget to hire 20, 50,
Sure,
75
right.
recruiters. That's very rare that a company will have that many recruiters. And
Yeah, it's
so
expensive.
the question, today is, how do we do more with the same or even less?
Yeah.
And our customers believe that there's an opportunity to use data, and specifically some modern technology, not to do the recruiting for you. It's still a relationship business, but the
Sure.
technology helps you have more face-to-face conversations more quickly.
Well,
And that's really where the magic happens. Yeah. go ahead.
yeah, my boss used to say work smarter, not harder.
Mhm.
So let's jump for the last topic to retention. And I will start with you, Steve. I do think, like we talked about keeping agents on, and I do think it's relevant to this conversation in that you're talking about, I mean, a lot of what I'm taking away from this is, look, they may not be your biggest producer today, but they might be your biggest producer tomorrow. Sean obviously has software that really helps identify those candidates, which is critical. But we want to keep them. So here's a great working example. You Chip, got your person that you've hired that was not a huge producer and now is your number two. How do you make sure they stay? So I know we have technology and culture and company and values and all those things are impossible to quantify, and everybody here feels so strongly about depending on where they work. But what about retention, Steve? And let's talk about that for finish it up on
Well,
retention.
leaving aside contractual retention terms, which we
Right.
discussed, clawbacks, there are a lot of firms that boast, high retention rates, and we're able to hold on to most of our agents. And they're able to do so because the agents are shackled by very onerous repayment terms if they joined within a couple of years, took TARP money, and then find themselves having to pay it back.
Yeah, I didn't even know that
Well,
until you told me that about people
Yeah,
having to
well,
pay it back.
and as I said during our prep call, Alcatraz had 100% retention rate. So which we could do that too. I think, there are a couple of areas, an agent that's been here for a long time and that is getting any number of the other calls. I think in order to understand the best retention policy, you really need to go back and focus on what the recruiting efforts are of the competitors who are making the calls and contacting our agents. And what are they offering and what do we have to offer? We're the devil you know. I think I think the notion of resetting splits at the end of the year has by and large gone out the window with a number of agents where if they've had a bad year, we're not resetting their split down to some low number that they hadn't seen in years before. What do they need in terms of marketing? What can we provide them more? Do a deep dive and understand their business. We're able to do that because we have a small, relatively small firm. So I know all of our agents, and we have marketing meetings and strategy meetings with our agents on a never-ending basis to understand what it is that their needs are. That's the strategy. It's a one-on-one strategy in knowing your agents, but knowing also what's being tossed out. Some firms will call up and say, we have the best technology in the world. For some agents, it matters. And for some agents, and for many of our high-producing agents, it matters less because they built up their business relying on technology, but not having great technology
Well,
source.
that's very true. I mean, I'll plug Local Logic a little bit only in that we do a lot of the sort of keep it simple, stupid, theory, as my father used to say, which is that you have to give people technology and data that they understand that is meaningful to them in making a decision, right? Not just sort of bombard people with, I was in a very big meeting in New York and the C-level person said, we don't want death by data. So I do think like that's part of what Sean does, that's part of what we do, which is to make the data meaningful, not just to bombard people. So Tyler, how about you guys for retention? I think one thing that's interesting that Stephen said that I'll dovetail to you is that about not penalizing people that if their production goes down, that all of a sudden they drop. I think that's interesting. I don't know much about that either. So I don't know if you want to jump on that a little bit.
Well, I was gonna say by remaining relevant, I think two things to keep in mind: having relationships, like knowing your people. And I think that's almost why our recruiting model complements Windermere, because we're pretty intentional actually about keeping our offices smaller so that we can maintain quality relationships with our agents. And what I found is it's very hard to be really good at having relationships with your current agents and focusing on recruiting, building your pipeline. So I think that's why it's worked well together right now, is letting our team handle the numbers game of the recruiting, introducing them, and then letting them
Well, while
manage
your
the
leadership and
relationship.
everybody, right?
Yeah. Also, what we're doing right now is we're rolling out a whole new on-suite of technology platforms, just constantly trying to be up to date. That's where we're rolling out Corded to our offices company-wide, with the main intent of them focusing on the tool for retention, so that they can have at a quick glance, and I'll let Sean actually talk about this, but at a quick glance, you can see, every agent in your office, who just had a closing, who is the closing with, are they up or down, or are they likely to have a risk of leaving right now? When you can, log in your computer the first time in the morning and look at that, I'm going to shoot this person an email really fast just to check in with them, see how they're doing.
Yeah,
schedule
right. So you
coffee
get
with
that
them.
real time touch. Yeah.
And it's just, it's a time saver, and it's a relationship saver, and it lets them know that, hey,
Yeah.
he's actually thinking about me, right? If they get a call from some recruiter trying to recruit them, they feel better connected with their branch manager, their team lead, whoever
Well,
it
it's
is.
funny. It's so true. As a high producing salesperson my whole career, I will tell you, nothing replaces a pat on the head and recognition. High producing salespeople always want to be told, "Great job." That's the most important thing to them. We are almost out of time, so I am gonna please do contact Sean if you want interested in Corded. He will walk you through it. Chip, I do want to finish with you in terms of retention. One thing I thought that was interesting to Tyler that kind of put a thought in my head too was, is it harder to touch people and pat them on the head with them being remote? You can do smaller offices, but more people don't come into the office as much. So does that get harder? And what do you guys do for retention at Michael Saunders?
Yeah, and I don't want to repeat some of what Tyler and Steven said, because I think there are the kind of similarities all the way across. But I'll say, when
Yeah.
Michael built the company, she was so intentional about core values. And so I think it's really sticking to your value proposition, not just saying that, but really believing in that and showing that. Of course, as both Tyler and Steven had mentioned, recognizing your people and showing appreciation, providing them with opportunities that others don't. And what we had chatted about on the pre-call here has a settlement change retention. I think that agents are looking for more clarity and guidance right now than ever before. And we've been very clear with our people that we see these potential changes as an opportunity for us to stand out even further in the market and the communities that we serve. And I think that's probably one of the most difficult roles for brokers at this time, where that clarity, the water in the crystal ball is a little bit murky. But I think agents can see through which brokers and companies are confident and which view it as an opportunity and which others are sticking their head in the sand.
Oh, I think that's a great point to end on. I was just thinking about that. And we'll call it so everybody has a chance to catch some coffee before their next meeting. But I do think that's a great point, which is that if nothing else, and brings us kind of full circle on the lawsuit, has given the good the chance, the opportunity to be great, right? In terms of how forward they've been, how open they've been, how hand holding. And I suspect, much like any relationship, professional or personal, when you go through, to Tyler's point, when you go through the tough times together, you're a little more loyal. So, good luck with all your recruiting. If you need to find Sean, I believe it is Sean at ported.io, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Thank you.
And you know where to find me. So our next webinar will be on SEO on June 11th. And SEO is not what you think it is anymore. So we're going to turn it on its head. Forget keywords. That's not what it is. So we'll talk about that next time. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you guys for joining me so much. All right.
Thank
Go
you.
have a go have a
Thank you
sandwich.
so much. Yeah.
Take care.